Sir, I would like to start with a broader question. Unlike the Progressive Writers Association, which we could broadly say was ideologically similar, the Nai Kahani was a loser category. Yet Nirmal Verma is considered as someone who started the Nai Kahani with his short story Parinde, as Nambar sir has mentioned. How would you describe the Nai Kahani as a literary movement historically, and what was Nirmal Verma's particular contribution to it?
The first thing one would like to say is that it's a bit odd talking about a Hindi writer in English. हिंदी लेखक के बारे में हिंदी में बात होनी चाहिए और बीच बीच में हिंदी आएगी भी
जी
लेकिन अब ठीक है अब अगर अंग्रेजी में बात करेंगे we talk in English then I suppose we'll win new admirers for Nirmal. So it's a missionary objective. About Nai Kahani and about the progressive writers' cohesion, let's keep progressive writers apart. There were very few progressive writers. When you look at them, and the main phase was already over by 1945, 1950. Nai Kahani begins after that. What dominates after that is the emergence and the dominance of progressive critics who sort by ideology rather than by the creative writing. So let's not go much into that. Nirmal himself was as progressive as anybody. When he was in St. Stephen's College as a student, he was a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. He resigned only in 1956 when half the party resigned over the Russian invasion, Soviet invasion of Hungary, when Hungary dissented just a little bit and they came in with their tanks. So between two communist countries. One of the defining moments in Nirmal's life was 1968, Prague Spring, when of course he was there. He'd been living in Prague for about 7 years, 6 or 7 years at that point, and that brought the final disillusionment. But he always retained the impress of that early communism and progressivism. Enough about that, about Nai Kahani now. Now the Nai Kahani, my own understanding of Nai Kahani, new story, is that it is thought to be, you say it's a looser movement than the progressives. Progressives, of course, follow a line. Fortunately, no other movement does. Non-progressive movements are individualistic. They may walk together, they may talk together, but they will not impose their views on anyone. But Nirmal is not a representative of Nai Kahani, to my mind. Nirmal may have started it, only Namvarji says that. And even Namvarji has been blamed for making a statement like that in the case of a writer like Nirmal. Because Nirmal did not turn out to be even fellow traveling with the progressives. But my understanding is, there were Kamleshwar, Rajendra Yadav, Mohan Rakesh, and Nirmal. These are the four who are connected with that, the first phase of Nai Kahani. They are entirely unlike each other. It's only the critical label of Nai Kahani which binds them together to some extent. Nirmal is the most unique of all these writers. Between the three others you can find some similarities, but with Nirmal, he travelled his own path, and that was also because of the circumstances of his life. He was the only one who went abroad, and who went abroad meaning not UK or USA, which is what we normally mean by abroad. He went to Czechoslovakia. He went to the second world. We have forgotten about the second world and the huge impact it had on our literary and cultural life. Nirmal discovered a new West for us. Our West until that time was America, and of course even more than that, our former rulers, the UK. There were a number of circumstances as to how he went to Czechoslovakia, but he stayed there for 6 years. He learned the language with greater efficiency than, for example, another writer, Bhisham Sahni, who went to Moscow and translated from Russian. But he himself has acknowledged in an interview much later that he never had a functional knowledge of Russian. He translated mainly from English and with the help of Russian people. Nirmal translated 11 books of Second World literature. Soviet writers, uh, Czech writers mainly, Milan Kundera, before he had been translated into English. He translated
Havel.
Karel Čapek, who was responsible for inventing robots, the word and the concept, in a play called R.U.R. So it's a very exciting discovery that he made. And he wrote later on, Prague, Europe ka Prayag hai. Is the Prayag of Europe because it's the confluence of cultures from East and West within Europe that get together there. Now that is part of the uniqueness of Nirmal, that he gets to know about another kind of foreignness. The importance of the foreign, his first novel is set entirely in Prague. It has only so-called foreign characters, only one character who's never named, he's called Indy, he's an Indian, he's the narrator. There hadn't been a novel like that before in Hindi. And a Czech critic, a lady whom I got to know very well, Dagmar Markova, who has translated some Nirmal back into Czech, and who has written with great sensitivity and authority about Nirmal's Czech experiences and writings, she has suggested something quite wonderful. In the 1950s again, in the case of Renu, for example, Anchalik Sahitya comes up. People begin writing about different remote areas of the vast Hindi land from 10 different states where Hindi is spoken, which mainstream Hindi readers never knew about. This is called Anchalik Sahitya. Markova has suggested that Nirmal made Eastern Europe, Communist Europe, Second World Europe, part of Hindi Anchalik Sahitya by discovering another Anchal, another region, which he brought into Hindi literature. This and by making it part of Hindi. This thrilling discovery of new kinds of subject matter is a thrill generation after generation of readers. And he has depicted Europeans, white people, who were not amongst our colonial masters, which is again a very rare occurrence. In one of his short stories, for example, they're usually love stories. I think apart from the novel, there are 10 or 11 short stories that are set entirely in Czechoslovakia. Some others are set in Venice or London or so on. But in Czechoslovakia, he describes a lady, young lady, and he says, वो कभी झूठ नहीं बोलती थी, छोटी से छोटी बात में भी नहीं. This is a startling statement of how they are different from us. It seems literal, it seems factual, it seems somehow absurd. क्योंकि हम लोग तो हर एक बात में झूठ बोलते हैं. That is our politeness. I'm not talking about big झूठ. I'm talking about छोटी से छोटी बात में झूठ. Suppose I say to you, have a cup of tea. You'll say, no, thanks. I've just had a cup of tea. Even if you have not had a cup of tea. That is Indian politeness. And the person that Nirmal is describing is not like that at all. Completely straightforward, forthright, if you like, literal, but different from us. The other, in such a simple way, small way. So Nirmal has annexed new territory for Hindi literature in a way that other writers of Nai Kahani movement did not, I don't think. And it may have been circumstances to start with, but he is an explorer of Europe as distinct from the UK and the USA in a way that is completely new and completely startling in Hindi.
Nirmal Verma's relationship with Europe is well documented, as you've mentioned, and he has mentioned several times the Europeans that he was fond of. However, he was someone who was equally fluent in both Hindi and English, and he consciously chose to write his fictions in Hindi and many of his critical essays in English. Furthermore, his writings have also been called European vis-a-vis certain experimentation with language, the fact that he brought European modernism into India. For example, with Stream of Consciousness being one example. how do you see Nirmal Verma's relationship, whether it be ingenuity or limitations, with his peculiar use of Hindi?
Yeah. You know, people talk about Nirmal as if he did not know Hindi. This is absurd. This is totally wrong. Nirmal's Hindi is stunning. Nirmal's Hindi is so resourceful, so wide-ranging. You know, I knew Nirmal. I first met Nirmal in 1976. There was a conference on George Eliot in Ramjas College in Delhi University. He was invited to chair a session in which I was reading a paper. My paper was on an adaptation by Premchand of a novel by George Eliot. Nirmal, chairing from the chair, said, I thought I knew my Premchand, but I had never heard of this one. So that's when our friendship began. I've known Nirmal intimately, very well. We've spent so many evenings together, we've traveled together, we've spoken in the same conferences. I've invited him to some conferences, we both have been invited to some, including Shimla, his hometown in a way, at the Indian Institute of Advanced Study. In daily conversation, in writing non-fictional prose, in writing fictional prose, his Hindi is as genuinely native-born first language Hindi as anybody's. And as I said, it has a wider range and wider expressiveness than most writers have been able to achieve. Even those first language writers in Hindi. Hindi also had many writers who came to it from elsewhere, from other languages. Premchand came from Urdu. Bhisham Sahni came from Urdu. Krishna Sobhuti came from Punjabi. Bhisham Sahni from Punjabi as much as Urdu. Ashk came from both Urdu and Punjabi. Mukti Bodh came from Marathi. Hindi has this power to draw people who began with one language to begin writing in Hindi. Nirmal wasn't like that. But yes, there is also English. Why do people say that? Because most Hindi writers, for good or bad, do not know the kind of English that Nirmal did. Nirmal went to a high-class school, which was for the sons of civil servants, as you know. His father was a fairly high-ranking civil servant. The British government operated from Delhi for 6 months and from Shimla for the summer months, and the school also travelled with the government. 6 months in Delhi, 6 months in Shimla. Now, in Hindi, there is a kind of glamour attaching to such people writing in Hindi. And also some misunderstanding. I gave example. Not quite as posh. His father too was a high-placed government officer. He too travelled all over India. He studied in some of the best places, comparable to St. Stephen's, where Nirmal was. Another connection between Nirmal and me from early on was that he had studied in St. Stephen's and I had taught in St. Stephen's. In fact, when I first met him, I was still teaching in St. Stephen's. So, but that doesn't take away from his Hindi, Hindi being absolutely his first language. So there were some essays that he delivered, which he wrote in English, but there was no fiction at all that he wrote in English. He could have, perhaps. But it's a matter of allegiance, it's a matter of showing which one's first language is. But another reason why people look a little askance at Nirmal's Hindi is that he deliberately makes it new. He renews the language, he extends the language, and sometimes he brings in foreign effects which are so new and startling in Hindi that they really arrest attention. I'll give you one very simple example. Ve chamkile din the. Those were bright days. Now, nobody says bright days, nobody says that is chamkila. He deliberately did that. In some other places, he calls it ujjwal. He has a whole range of Hindi vocabulary from which he picks and chooses. Then he also syntactically he uses something new. In fact, all this I pointed out, the hidden element of English brought in deliberately by Nirmal into his Hindi. These are not accidental. He has thought about it. He has seen that Hindi does not have, like every language, some languages have different capabilities. That in Hindi you cannot say certain things in a way that you can say in English, for example, or maybe even in Czech. One question to ask is, Was Nirmal sometimes thinking in Czech and writing in Hindi? Somebody should investigate that. We can only see what is there in English and comes across in Hindi. For example, in that paper, and Nirmal was in the audience, and we had a long discussion afterwards in Shimla. Another example I gave was, एक पहाड़ी है, वहां से तुम सारा शहर देख सकते हो. This is not a Hindi sentence. This is not a traditional Hindi sentence. The traditional Hindi sentence would be, वहां से सारा शहर दिखाई देता है. You have to say it in the passive voice. And you cannot say tum. Tum is you, which does not mean you in English. It means anyone. तुम वहां से सारा शहर देख सकते हो. मतलब कोई भी, anyone can see the whole city spread out from there. You is new and passive active is new. And Nirmal is doing it deliberately. How does one extend the capacity of one's language? Creative writers do it through exactly such experimentation. About Europe, Nirmal knew more about Europe, and Nirmal knew Europe more intimately than almost any other Hindi writer. The only possible exception would be Agay. Nirmal has paid very handsome, fulsome tribute to Agay, and very rightly. But they're also very different. Nirmal explores human psychology and relationships in a way that even Agay did not. And it's not only love. Love is there, but love not in the traditional sense. Recently I was asked to write on the subgenre of the love story. There are very few love stories, really good love stories in the world, I found. In Hindi, perhaps even fewer. And the one example that comes back to me is Ek Raat Ka Mehman. He has so many love stories set in the West, and this is also set in London. But Ek Raat Ka Mehman is very special because husband and wife, as you will recall, have separated. They're living in different countries. Husband has come here. He goes back to visit the wife and the child and to see if it's possible to get together again. And the incompatibility now, the bitterness is tearing at their hearts. And that too is love. But it's not only love stories. Love together or apart, or both together and apart, as in Ek Raat Ka Mehman. Nirmal is equally good at describing family relationships, and better than most writers in Hindi. You know, Gyan Ranjan is praised for his short story Pita. About Pita, I think an even better short story is Beech Bahas Mein by Nirmal. You know, the DNA connection, the genetic connection and attraction towards each other and affiliation in the literal sense, and at the same time difficulty of communicating. So that in that story in which the father is lying in a hospital and the son is lying on the floor attending to him, a nurse comes and they're talking all the time, and the nurse comes and says, "Aap log hardam bahas kyun karte rehte hain? And why are you arguing all the time?" And the son realizes for the first time that what he thought to be normal conversation between him and his father has struck a stranger as arguing all the time. And this is a measure of the depth of that relationship and the complexity of that relationship, which is captured in the title. There's a story like Dhage about brothers and sisters. There's a story called Antaral about an elder brother who is perhaps in an early stage of depression, a story that I translated. Nirmal asked me to translate it because some anthologist had asked him to contribute a story, and that's the one he had just written. I don't think it's been published in Hindi at that stage. And a number of other situations in which he explores what is the basic relationship frame in India in a much stronger way than in the West, which is the family. It's not the same thing in the West. this is as Indian as it gets. People do not realize that Nirmal cannot be matched in these respects of psychologically exploring the complexities, not love-hate, but love and different kinds of love within the family. People say, there's not, it's again the progressive line, dominant in criticism, though not in literature, in the, Hindi as I understand it. Where is Samaj? Where is Rajniti? And so on. And Nirmal has said many interesting things in his essays about this. And what he wishes to emphasize is, literature is not meant for that kind of gross sociological inquiry. And because literature has been used by critics and readers as another form of sociology or anthropology, extract the substance, tell me what the plot is, the rest can go hang. That is why I think the place of literature in our lives has shrunk. Is being driven out of discourse because people want facts. People want social reality and nothing else. But Nirmal, exploring states of mind, exploring, one wants to be alone from time to time. Ekant ki pavitrata, he has said. A holy space that you can have, that you can occupy only when you are by yourself. People talk about it in different idioms. Everybody wants their own space. But that space is when you are looking within, not only when you are just physically alone. He is tremendous at depicting all that.
This is a continuation from my previous question. So Professor Jaydev has written about how Nirmal Verma, and this is his critique of Nirmal Verma's writing also, that how Nirmal Verma's existential writings tend to be imitating European existentialism to some extent and hence not really grounding it in an Indian context. As a result, it may appear that he is not necessarily doing justice to both European existentialism and particular Indian concerns. He himself believes that Mohan Rakesh has managed to do that better. So, do you think this is possibly a fair critique, or your comments on this?
Let me tell you a story first. Jaydev I knew very well. Jaydev taught in Shimla, at the university there. He was a fellow at the institute. When he had written his fellowship book,
Cultural Pastiche,
which is this one, Cultural Pastiche, it somehow came to me. I was the referee to say whether it should be published or not and whether it should be revised. Well, it's a brilliant piece of work. It's a brilliant piece of critical work, and I had no doubt that it should be published. But I wrote a very long report. I knew Jaydev anyhow. I knew him very well. I had great respect for him. Why? Because he was a man of tremendous personal integrity. And what was he? A Gandhivadi. He was not a progressive. He was an Adarshvadi, he was a Gandhivadi, and therefore he was a Swadeshvadi. And therefore he hated everything Western, including existentialism. And he could not brook the shadow of any Western influence falling on any Indian. There are some Marxists also who say that kind of thing. One should ask them, where does Marxism come from? I mean, the West has given us so many things in so many different ways. And why do we say that some of them are beneficial and some of them are not, just because of this one criterion? So, I must say, we discussed this, Jaydev and I, and you will not believe it by reading the book, but he actually moderated many of his statements in all the chapters. And then the book, I didn't make it a condition. I said the book can be published as it is. It's so brilliant. But between him and me, having said that, having concluded the formal part of the report, these are points that can be strengthened in argument. And sometimes to strengthen an argument, you have to modify it, you have to mitigate it, make it sound more credible. As about existentialism, tell me, is there any writer in India from the 1960s and 70s who has not been accused of being an existentialist? You know, there was a kind of a fashion. Some people wanted to claim that they were existentialists without being existentialists. For example, everybody was doing magic realism after that. There are these waves that come. These are these trends, fashions that come. And we want to be part of it. It's a part of our colonial backwardness that we wanted to be part of the latest in the West. Never Nirmal. I would say that you are Anantamurthy, for example, is far more an existentialist writer than Nirmal. There are many existentialist moments when there is a crisis, inner crisis in a character, such an excess of emotional anxiety that the person actually trembles before making a choice. In Anantamurthy and in others, not in Nirmal in that sense. No. In Nirmal, there is instead something that existentialism did not have much time for, which is not the absurdity of life, not the difficulty of making choices, but on the other hand, the realization of the sadness inherent in human experience ultimately. So that, in Hindi the words that he uses, nisangata, detachment, udasinata, which is not sadness, which is not indifference, because udasin is a technical word almost in Hindi phraseology. Those are the words that he uses, and those I do not associate with existentialism. There's also something about stream of consciousness. No, he did not write stream of consciousness. No. The first time I met him at his house, he was living in a Barsati, in his family house. They lived there for long, long years. And he sat on the floor, there was a gadda, and that's where we sat, any visitors. And above his head, on the wall, there was a big portrait of Virginia Woolf. Almost iconic. Everybody who visited Nirmal in his Barsati remembers that. But, stream of consciousness is again a different thing in James Joyce from what it is in Virginia Woolf. The enterprise there, as I understand it, and my PhD was on Virginia Woolf, the enterprise there is to convey how the mind, the heart, not so much the heart, just the mind and consciousness are unfathomable and unpredictable. That they go in uncontrollable ways here and there, and that most of the time we aren't even conscious of it at the level at which we are operating in the world. That there is a subterranean stream flowing alongside. That is not Nirmal's endeavor. Nirmal goes deeper and deeper in a way that is quite predictable. But these are questions of detail.
Yeah.
Yes, one cannot go into them. When one talks, one has to write about them.
My last question is something what I noticed in his fictions as well. Is this, you also briefly touched upon it, that this continuous attempt to communicate and understand the other, whether it be gender, age groups, or between an Indian and a European cultural differences. At the same time, Nirmal Verma also highlights the limits of understanding. How much can you understand? How much should you understand? Because the characters also remain silent after a certain point. So, how did he understand dialogue between two individuals or cultures? Since he was also interested in certain questions like tradition and cosmopolitanism. So,
again, you've asked 3 questions in one. These are all questions. Let me pick, I think, what I wish to talk about. Yes. Number one, the other. This has come into a discourse, into parlance later. The othering of the other is not really being sympathetic. It is insisting on one's own identity and therefore making a concession that other people may have their own different identity. I don't think that's very helpful. There's not much of that to be found in Nirmal. About silence, it's like ekant. Ekant is not a negative state. Solitary, alone, lonely, all these in English sound mildly, faintly negative. No, in Hindi they are not. Ekaki is not negative. Ekant certainly is not negative. So, in that kind of a state, obviously, there is communication only with oneself. That should not be mistaken for silence. There is a deep communication going on when one is with oneself, and there is a similar deep communication going on in many places in Nirmal, many occasions in his fiction, where two persons are together, or more than two persons are together, and yet they are silent. They're looking at the same thing, or they may be looking at different directions, and each is full of intense feeling. And the other person has some kind of idea of what the other person is feeling. Sometimes a very acute idea of what the other person is feeling. And both are silent. It's not as if silence is not communication. Nirmal knew this. Nirmal also knew, for example, that if you look around, don't say anything, there is nature. There is so much nature in him. Not nature in the Wordsworth sense. You look up and stars are coming out. There's a breeze blowing. Simple things like this, which enhance the quality of communication in Nirmal. That is happening within that frame, within that context. In Vedin, the first novel in Prague, this happens repeatedly. Not much is said verbally, but a lot is said anyhow. And both persons have a better understanding of what the other is about because words do not distort it. I'll tell you an anecdote. Nirmal and Ramchandra Gandhi were very dear friends, the philosopher, who also taught with me in St. Stephen's. They were very good friends. Really got along very well together. Then one day they had a scrap about something or other. Philosophical scrap, I'm sure it was. Matter of belief. Nirmal used to get very annoyed when there was disagreement of a kind that he thought was not helpful to further communication. So they stopped speaking to each other for many months. And then one day, Nirmal went across in the India International Center to where Ramu was sitting by himself. And he went and sat there, and they sat together for about half an hour, and neither of them spoke a word. And then Nirmal said to him, "Don't think I've come to talk to you. I've just come to sit here together with you in silence." Now this is the kind of understanding which assumes a very deep connection. And this is the kind of communication without words which is perhaps deeper and more complex than any words can communicate.